How to create for podcast and video, YouTube, at the same time. There are a few things to think about. First, we will discuss what podcasting actually is. Then we will discuss what YouTube actually is, or video actually is. Then we will compare those two. And fourth, we will see whether there are similarities that are big enough that you can actually record the same content for both platforms and just distribute them kind of differently. So the content, again, would be the same. So let's dive first into podcasting. What is podcasting actually? It's the distribution of audio. Currently, there are major different audio distribution platforms because there are different audio types. A podcast is basically the most open type. You could also say the most open source type because everybody can create a podcast, but not everybody can create a book. Of course, everybody could theoretically create a book, but that's not the point. The point is that the hurdle to get into book publishing is much harder because you first have to write a book. So therefore, there are different types of audio that are available at this point in time for consumption. The first part is the podcasting. The podcasting is just audio. But what you also could do is just record yourself playing the guitar, and that's then called music. Therefore, music is a subgenre of audio that has its own distribution. Spotify, streaming services, in the past CDs, vinyl. It's basically a subgenre of audio. Then what we also have is scripted audio that is also in long format form. And this can be already a podcast, but it most likely is a book that just has an audio version. Of course, there are many different other things, but I think we will, by concentrating on these three, we get the most of what is available out there. Of course, there are also sounds available. Of course, there is also, I don't know what else would be available on audio, but let's just concentrate on these three. So now let's concentrate again, not only on these three, but on the first one out of these three, the podcasting. What now is podcasting? It's you recording something into a microphone, or anybody recording something into a microphone. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a person recording the things into a microphone. It could also be a computer reading things. So basically, the only format constraint that constrains podcasting is that it is audio, and it then is distributed at the same time through the podcasting network. What is now the podcasting network? Podcasting is basically compared to music. Music is also a little bit, but compared to music and also compared to books, much more open source. What do I mean by this? So basically, a podcast is nothing else than, first of all, an audio file. It's a recorded audio file. And it's probably not only one audio file, but a series of recorded audio files. Now, if you create these audio files by speaking into a microphone, what you can do, and what you could do, and what you probably are doing if you already have a podcast, is to upload these files to a computer that is accessible 24/7. And if a computer is connected to the internet and accessible 24/7, then we call this a server. A server now acts as the host for your audio files. And therefore, it is your hosting platform, your podcast hosting platform. And now what this one does, so this is now here. First it was down here, it was with you, recorded audio files, and then it moved a layer up into the cloud. What now happens is that there are many different platforms these days that want to access this file. So basically you go to Spotify and say, hey, we have files here, do you want them? This is the title of the podcast. And then Spotify says, maybe. And you give Spotify the link to this directory in the cloud. And then Spotify can access these files. So whenever somebody on Spotify now wants to listen to a podcast, then what they easily can do, so basically what they are doing is they are just accessing this link to your directory in the internet on your podcasting host, and then accessing this file, streaming it, or downloading it. Keep in mind that this is not always the linear case, so they don't always go back to the originating file, but sometimes platforms just, I think Spotify actually does this, copy the original files onto their own servers in order to improve stability when streaming. So now, this is podcasting. It can be anything. It can be sounds the rain made, just as a podcast. Podcast is not so much, when we think of podcast these days, we think of Joe Rogan, we think of maybe Huberman Lab. I think of Huberman Lab because I actually listen to Huberman Lab. That's a podcast about optimizing performance, you could say, in the widest sense. And now, the idea is that it could be anything. This means you can create anything as a podcast. Now, there is also the old system that is not with these individual platforms. You probably know Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, but instead works even more open source, and this is called RSS. That's a technology that just is, if this is your podcast host, then it's just a layer above. It's a link that directs actually to this one. So basically, you give somebody the RSS, and the RSS feed is then a self-actualizing feed that checks every now and then if there are new files in the directory, and if there are new files in the directory, then you have a new episode in your podcast. So now, that's podcasting. Let's now see what YouTube, or in general, video actually is. And since YouTube still kind of has a monopoly on internet video, on long-form internet video, nowadays maybe also soon short video, but it still is the main long video platform, I would say. And that's the reason I would sometimes use it, or I also sometimes used it simultaneously, not only simultaneously, but interchangeably, I actually think is the right word. So now what is YouTube? YouTube is basically the same concept as podcast, just without the RSS feed. And now the idea is that YouTube actually takes the platform level we discussed, so Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and combines it with the hosting level. This now means, so host, for example, would be Spotify-owned Anchor, or also Podigy, or also other podcast hosting platforms. So now it combines these two. It combines the platform itself, and therefore also the search and things like these, with the actual hosting. So therefore, internet video at this point in time theoretically would be the same thing as podcasting. It's just that it doesn't have as many layers, because these layers are actually combined into one platform. You can record your video, then you're on the file level again, then you upload it, then you're already on the YouTube level, and then you distribute it also onto YouTube. Therefore, you are in the same level twice, which now means it's easier for you because you don't have to worry about these other things. But because technology advances, there are now hosting services like Anchor, for example, that also automatically distribute your podcast, which is very convenient because then you don't have to worry about giving all these platforms these links, what you had to do in the past if you actually want your podcast to be available, wanted your podcast to be available on multiple platforms. So now, for YouTube, what you want to do depends on what you want to film. Because the main distinction criteria is that instead of audio files, audio-only files, we now have video files. And because you can pretty much upload anything to YouTube apart from things that are out of the guidelines of YouTube and therefore get flagged or get copyright strikes, you can still, the same is true for podcasts. It's just that the podcast space, because of the kind of open source, the open source structure is not as controlled as of now as the video space. Because let's say you are a government and you say we want to reduce hate speech, then in terms of video, you can go to these big platforms. You can go to Facebook and say, there's a video on your platform. What did you do about this video? Nothing. And that's the problem. So if you now go to YouTube, to Facebook, that's very easy because these platforms combine the hosting and the distribution. So basically these two upper levels. And in podcast, it's not as easy because there are different platforms. And that's also the reason Spotify, for example, is regulating these days more and more when it comes to the podcast. So Joe Rogan, for example, was regulated because he actually said things that Spotify or the general consensus deemed not right, or some people deemed not right. And therefore, they said he spread misinformation, or they said he discussed things about COVID-19 which weren't appropriate. And therefore, Spotify is now also turning into not only a music platform, but also turning into an audio platform that is more and more similar, because Anchor is also Spotify owned, to the YouTube, because it now combines both these levels. Anchor, the hosting platform, is Spotify owned, and now Spotify also is Spotify owned, and YouTube is also on this level, on the hosting level, and on the distribution level, YouTube owned. Now, here's the idea. If we take a look at content on YouTube, then the main distinction is the video, is the additional thing that you can see things. One side effect of this is that you can do things while listening to something, walking around, doing the dishes, riding your bike in terms of physical activity, and to increase your physical activity maybe. But when it comes to video, because it's visually based and it doesn't go into our ears and therefore straight in our brain, you actually need your eyes. And if your eyes need to process different kinds of information because you are doing something, you cannot just look at video without interrupting the efficiency of this main process. So if you are, let's say, what would be a process that would be appropriate? If you are typing, you're a journalist and you're typing, and you're watching video while you're typing, it's probably not something that increases the efficiency of the overall of your work or of the process. So now, this also means for podcast, it's a format that can be longer because they don't have their devices in front of them, either the phone or the notebook or the tablet. But what this means is now, if you have a device in front of you and it requires one-on-one time with you, from you, then it's much easier to switch. And on podcast, it's not as easy to switch. Therefore, podcasts vary by format, basically. By the way we perceive reality, it's just a format that can be longer because not everybody pulls out their phone if he or she doesn't like a podcast and skips to the next podcast. Of course, you can skip on your headphones, but compared to a situation where you sit in front of a screen and where you are 100% attention focused on the content, podcast is something that is much more easygoing and flowing because, well, you can just do it while doing something else. So now, these were the two major points of this video. Let's now dive into the third major point of this video. What we actually already dove into the third point, which was the comparison between these two platforms. And now let's dive into the fourth major point, which is where they overlap. They overlap then when the videos on YouTube, so if you now want to treat a podcast, so if you want to produce for podcast and for video, so for audio and for video at the same time, then it's pretty obvious. But the audio alone, on its own, has to be good. But the video on its own doesn't really make sense on its own because video is always with audio. Because there is no just picture-based video that doesn't have audio. That's called silent video. But nobody watches silent video anymore because somebody invented sound. So now the idea is, if it's a video and it has a good sound, that doesn't require the visual field. So an easy example would be, here is a graph of the climate change and here is how temperature goes up and you can see here and here and here. Then this is something that requires your visual focus, and not only requires but makes the video better. Of course, if you just take the audio of this video and listen to it, it could also be something you could actually listen to. But the problem is, the problem arises when you have something in your video which is obvious if you look at the video, if you watch the video, but is not obvious if you just listen to the sound. So if I say, look at right here, and that's the reason for this, then somebody who listens to this won't understand it because he can see it pretty easily. So now, how do you strategize about this? Should you concentrate on improving the audio and then maybe add the video for the video platforms? Or should you focus on creating a good video and then just taking the audio of this video, therefore just formatting the file format into audio, and therefore making it accessible as a podcast? So basically you would mainly create videos and only making them accessible as an audio version. So let's now discuss the two different things. The first one would be that you create a good audio. The problem is just, if you have a good audio, you have to add video for the video platforms. So how could you do that? You could do that by having a traditional podcast, basically, and then there are apps these days which kind of make the podcast itself, the audio itself, a little bit more accessible. The first step is obviously a static image. So first of all, you can just take a static image of your podcast logo and turn it into a video. And then you have the static image and the audio. That's something that's visually and also on YouTube probably not very appealing compared to the other choices YouTube offers you. Mr. Beast videos, for example. So now the idea is, if you focus on audio and you just add a little bit of video, then that's not going to work. It has to be a video that actually works as video. So now there are two options mainly. The first one is to create reality as it is and use it as video. The problem only is if you have an audio and then, for example, you create a talking head, but you already have the audio, then that's not the way it works, because you would have to remember all of the things you said and then say them. You get it, I think. The point is, if you want to create a talking head video, then you create the video first and then you transform it into the audio. The other option is that you create something that is edited. So therefore you don't have a feed. So the audio is usually just a feed. Of course, you can also create an edited version of audio. That's kind of an audio edited video. Not video, but it's just edited audio. And the same is true for video, of course. You can also take a video and chop it and clip it and turn it into maybe a more appealing video. But now, and this is only, it doesn't really matter what you do. You can do something edited, you can do something that's unedited. But the idea is, if you edit audio or video, it takes a lot of time, of course, but also it probably increases the appealingness. But the main point is that if you create video, the easiest way to just create video is to record the audio and the video simultaneously, just as I'm doing right now, without cutting even. But that's just another strategy entirely, not cutting the video. So now, what could you otherwise do if you have already the audio and want to create video? Apart from, so the first layer is you just record a live feed of you talking. The second layer is you create an edited version, basically, of different things you recorded with your camera, of stock footage you have from the internet. So basically there are sites, platforms that let you access video somebody else recorded with for a few bucks, or also a few more bucks, or also a membership. Sites like Shutterstock, Point5, and also Storyblocks just offer basically video footage to you. You then can use to turn your video into an audio. Again, very heavy in editing, because you obviously have to search footage for the type of videos. A very easy way would, for example, be, not very easy, but that's kind of the most common way. You just take the audio, and then if you talk about flowers, you just show footage or an image of flowers. If you then talk about YouTube strategy, you show maybe people creating with a camera, like Casey Neistat. So basically just visualizing the things that are said on the audio part. And now there is another way, which is basically to use something that is not based in reality, which is not recorded reality, but is something new. You could make animations, for example. You could also make some drawings, but drawings again are kind of recorded reality. If you, for example, have an audio and you, while recording the audio, draw something, then that's again maybe more in the space of recording reality, because you're actually doing it live in reality. But if you then go onto the internet and search for things where you can actually move different graphics around and have these explainer videos, then that's also an artificial layer on top. So therefore, what you need is, so this is how you would create a video out of an audio file. But keep in mind, the audio file is not just the audio file. The audio file is basically a script that is already recorded as an audio. The script, of course, can include a lot of amps because it's recorded live, but basically everything we say is a script. It's just that nobody wrote it down. So therefore, the idea is also, what you could do is, before even the audio, you could create the script itself. And then, by recording the audio and the video maybe even simultaneously, you create a video and an audio for the script. The script is not a file format on its own, but it's rather just the idea that you plan something before recording it. And if planning include, and if planning includes you writing things down before, then it's just an additional planning. You could also just remember the whole thing, just like stage actors actually do, and then perform all the things. So the script is not a file format on its own, even though if you store the script, it becomes something visual, which can be accessible as a blog, for example, as an Instagram post if you add pictures, or as a Facebook post, or also appear as article in a newspaper. So now, that was the first option, turning audio into video, maybe scripting it before. But the same approach can be also used for video. Just if you create native video instead of native audio, you're doing, I think, yourself a favor. Because if you create audio, because most of us create audio by speaking and maybe by adding sounds, but that's just the editing layer again. But if you record yourself speaking, you're doing yourself a favor if you also turn on the lights. Of course, that's additional labor. Of course, that's additional work and effort. But if you turn on the lights and record yourself, then you already have a very appealing, at least appealing compared to a static image with the audio, video, which you then can distribute to YouTube, to all the video platforms, and simultaneously have a good audio if you record in good audio quality. So now, how to basically streamline these formats, that in a way that you would have the podcast just as a copy of all the videos on your YouTube feed or on your video feed. But you select just the ones that are actually applicable for audio. So here is now my strategy, the strategy I am using at this point in time. I have 4 different content types. The 4 different content types all are hosted on one channel. And the 4 different content types are short video, which isn't really a content type on its own, but it is much more defined as below 60 seconds. Or also could be 60 seconds, but 0 to 60 seconds. It could be something that is scripted. It also could be something that is not scripted. The main criteria is it is 60 seconds. Then I have the same in long, everything above 60 seconds. Of course, you could create different distinctions like medium, long, but I'd say something is long if it's more than 60 seconds, because then it isn't a short. It isn't a YouTube short, because YouTube shorts only go up to 60 seconds. It's also not a traditional TikTok, but much more a YouTube video now that is also living on TikTok, because TikTok now allows 5 or 10-minute videos. That's the second format. The third format is the blog, which I previously called code, because code is something you script and you plan before, and therefore I just call it code because it's an easy word. It's a 4-letter word, and therefore comparing these 2 content formats became very easy, became very accessible for me if I don't have descriptions that are like 2 sentences for one specific content type. That makes it easier. So therefore the content type is scripted video, not scripted video. I just said something wrong. The content type is basically a blog script. But the blog script is meant to be recorded as a screen recording video. That means I simultaneously then have an audio file, if I take the audio file from the video, and also have a video file I then can distribute to YouTube. And this means I don't have just a podcast with a static image on YouTube. And so basically what I'm saying is that I have, out of the blog format, so this one, I have created 3 different sub-files. Not sub-files, but sub-formats that live on different platforms. The script itself lives on the blog, the audio itself lives on the podcast, and the video itself lives on the video platforms, the long video platforms. And then the 4th format is a future format, which I haven't planned yet, which is an interview style video. Again, video, because of course, it's kind of a podcast because I interview people, but that's not the idea about the podcast. What I'm describing podcast now as is the audio. It's just the audio. So therefore, I create again video, maybe in the future with guests. And this is the 4th format. I just call this the show. And this would be a format where I would also interview people, as I already said. And this would be accessible on YouTube and or available on YouTube and also audio. So podcast, audio equals podcast. So now, here's what you actually can take from your YouTube feed and turn into a podcast. You cannot turn, I think at this point it doesn't really make sense, the short videos into a podcast. Why? Because audio clips that are 60 seconds, imagine yourself listening to something, working out, for example, and listening to something, and there is just a video, not a video, but the audio from a video that is just you talking for 15 seconds, and you listen to it maybe in 2 times the speed, and then it's gone in 30 seconds. So I don't think, because listening is something else, because listening is much more long format, because people tend to listen longer to things on one sitting, I don't think shorts should be turned into a podcast at this point in time. Of course, you could create a short audio podcast channel, but then just throwing in, so you have a normal 40-minute episode, for example, and then you throw in just a 15-second thing with the intro and the outro, then it's just something that is, I think, not very smart, strategic at this point in time. Maybe in the future it is, but I don't think now it is. So therefore, the first format you can take is the blog. The blog is already a screen recorded video that is then also audio, that is also a podcast episode. Therefore, the first format for the podcast is blog, or code, as I previously called it. This also means now you can create very nice videos that are edited and also scripted. You just produce them as videos, and then you just produce them in a way, and this is how you simultaneously produce for both platforms, in a way where you don't point at graphs and say this is this and this is this and this is this, but you just use footage that is additional but is not necessary for the understanding of the content. And if you, for example, take a look at a Wendover Productions video or Polymeter, which are very good channels, or also Real Engineering, and sometimes it works that you could actually turn this into an audio version, but sometimes it doesn't. And the main criteria is, I think, that the visual part should be additional, should be better for understanding, but should not be necessary for understanding. If it's necessary for understanding, then you should not turn it into an audio. So therefore, the process now, what would the process look like? It's something we will discuss after we will discuss the 4 content formats till the end. So blog can be an audio version, or code can be an audio version. This is also, so if you want to create if you want to create a video that looks like a Polymeter video, for example, what you could do, first write the script, then you already have a blog post. Then you produce the video with the additional layers of a video on top of it, and then you already have an audio, and you will also have a video. But if you just want to write a blog post, then you also just turn it into a video and audio by just screen recording it. So therefore, both scenarios are covered by this content distribution system I just mentioned, and also offer formats for multiple platforms. So now we have blog, we have the shorts. Shorts are not something. We have now the show also. The show obviously is made for a podcast, because 2 people talking is just something that doesn't require visuals. Of course, you can Joe Rogan it, as someone recently said, and I realized he just made up a new word. So Joe Rogan it is basically pulling a picture of something up in a podcast because they are talking about it. Of course, this creates a visual component that is maybe necessary to understanding, which is a kind of a hurdle if you want to create an audio podcast only. But again, or if you want to turn your video into a podcast, but again, well, you could just leave it out, and therefore you would actually have to also in conversation talk about this thing as if it were not there. And talking about something as if it were not there, describing it, is basically something you do for the listeners. So now, the interview style obviously can live on both YouTube and podcast. And now, fourth and finally, the normal YouTube video. You have to create your YouTube videos in a way that, again, don't require the visual information, but the visual information is just a part that is additional. If this means now that you create something like exactly this video in terms of style, in terms of format, then this is something that can very easily also be a podcast. because I didn't use graphics. I didn't point at things and said, oh, this is this, this is this. I basically explained everything in language, and that's the key difference. So now, if you already have a YouTube channel and you want to see if you just should make a podcast copy of this YouTube channel, then I would say that first you cut out the shorts. If you post shorts to your channel, just don't post them to your audio channel. You just automatically, basically, copy paste the show format onto audio. You also use the blog format if you write scripts and turn them into screen recordings or real videos, bend over production videos. Then you also probably can turn them into an audio version. If you, in the process of making them, again, keep in mind the general rule of only adding visual information that is not necessary to the understanding. And fourth and finally, the solo format, as I call it, or the long video format, as I call it, where I'm just alone in terms of my content strategy, is a format you also, when creating, should just pay attention to, not creating something that it also lives on audio. So now the problem is, what if you actually show something in a long format video? So now, what if I'm here and I take my phone, even though that's just a case, and I'm like, oh, let's see, this is the app I use, and this. Then, I think the easiest way to tackle this problem is just to track all the videos you have and to just quality check them real quick and to look if there is something in the video where you actually show something, and then just have a criteria in your Notion creation database, for example, where you can very easily say, okay, visual things don't convert as podcast. This applies not to the shorts because you don't post them anyway. This only applies to the solo videos or maybe also the scripted videos, because you have to sort out the things. You don't want to have a listener that is frustrated because the people just talk about things that are not understandable with audio only. And that's how you streamline content production along different platforms and posting content simultaneously, maybe even the same exact type of content, just in different file formats, to multiple platforms.